Good evening, everyone, and I'm Mary Kay O'Lean Berkey, and I'm chair of the Government Committee for League of Women Voters of Johnson County. I want to welcome all of you to tonight's program on tax reform and its impact on Kansas. This is one of the public service programs that we do under the title of JOCO in the Know, and they are sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Johnson County. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce you to our facilitator for the program. This is Paul Johnson, and he is the Kansas League of Women Voters Legislative Liaison. So Paul, will you take away the program?
All right. Is this better? Can you hear this? This works good. Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight, and with pending weather problems, etc. And there should be a very special thanks to all the work and organizing that the Johnson County League of Women Voters have done to set this forum up. They really asked the right experts to really discuss the basis of taxes and budgets. And I think they've really got the right questions and focus in order to give us a full breadth of what's going to happen with tax policy. We have experts on taxes, we have experts on the budget, we have experts on human services caseloads, and we have experts on what's going to happen at the local level in Johnson County and other places on what these tax changes are about. And also a very special thanks to Shawnee Northwest High School for videotaping this forum, and going to put this up on YouTube and hopefully disseminate as far and wide as possible in Johnson County. So I have the privilege of moderating, facilitating, and trying to control this panel of experts. I write a weekly e-report, legislative report for the League of Women Voters of Kansas for the last 5 years. And I've been around Topeka for 30 years. I've been a legislative advocate. I've worked on poverty, on energy, on affordable housing, on family farm issues. So I'm pretty familiar with these budgets and what's happening with taxes at this point. Politics is often about timing, and I don't think this forum could come at a better time for where the discussion is at in Topeka. The regular session of the Kansas legislature ended on April 5th. They're off until their veto session starts on May 8th. And what they left undone was to pass a further tax bill in our state legislature. And the second thing that they left undone was a 2014 state budget of around $14 billion for our state. And we're really at a point of fundamental tax debate in our state. Last year, the mega tax, income tax cut bill that was signed by the governor was the largest tax decrease in the history of Kansas. But maybe even more importantly than that was that the whole premise is built to eliminate the individual income tax first, maybe eventually the corporate income tax over 5, 6, 7, 8 years. In Kansas. For several decades, Kansas has had a very balanced revenue policy between property taxes, between sales taxes, and between income taxes. So what we're talking about now is eliminating one leg of a three-legged stool that has worked in Kansas for a long time. And we have the experts here tonight that are going to walk you through the implications of these tax changes, budget problems, what it may mean to human services, caseloads, human resources, and how the local units of government are going to be able to respond. Our first presenter is Chris Courtright. He's the chief economist for the Kansas Legislative Research Service. Our second presenter will be Dwayne Gosen. Presently, he's the Vice President for Fiscal and Health Policy at the Kansas Health Institute. I knew Dwayne as Budget Director under Bill Graves for several years and Kathleen Sebelius for several years, so he has years in the trenches understanding and detailing these things. Our third presenter will be Andy McKay. She's the executive director of the Kansas Center for Economic Growth. And our fourth presenter will be Ed Eilert. I'm familiar with him. He's the chair of the Johnson County Commission, and he's going to give us an update on what happens with local, the impact on local governments at this point. During the presentations, there will be distributed a questionnaire that people can write comments, thoughts, questions, what they're hearing from the panelists. And then after we have the 4 15-minute presentations by the panelists, then I'll look through those questions and we'll get some feedback from the audience, and we'll try having a dialogue as to really what is happening at this point with this debate. So Chris gets to start us off here, and we'll go from there.
What I'm going to do is visit with you, as Paul mentioned, about how we got to this particular very interesting point in Kansas tax policy history, and then hopefully that will be able to go into a little bit the contours of the ongoing debate. It's still going on here in 2013, and then I'll segue nicely into some of the comments Dwayne's going to have about the overall budget issues and this kind of thing. I think one of the first things that we often talk about relative to the history of Kansas tax policy is in the early 90s, before the 1992 school finance law came on the books. If you look at sort of the 3 legs of the stool approach, which I'll talk about here in just a second, Kansas, the state and local finance systems, property taxes, the property plus the car taxes were about 39% of the system. Okay, sales and use taxes were about 22, 23%, and income and privilege taxes about 21%. Okay, now everyone was up in arms during the late 80s and early 90s after reappraisal and classification. Everyone was up in arms about property taxes, and so the decision was made intentionally in the 1992 school finance law that we're not only going to do what the courts are telling us and equalize spending levels per pupil between and among the 300 school districts. We're going to raise sales and income taxes and pump all that new money through the school finance formula to buy down and equalize property tax levies. Okay, we intentionally are going to try to equalize the sales, income, and property tax burden and move more to a 3 pretty much co-equal legs to the stool. And as you can see here, by the late 1990s, that had in fact happened. They did buy down the property tax burden by reducing school finance property tax levies, and so you had about 31% property, 28 sales, and 28 use by the late 1990s. Why is this 3 legs to the stool thing important? Here's something that us pointy-headed economists talk about. We'd say with a diversified revenue portfolio, not relying too heavily on a single tax source, Kansas state and local governments are better able to withstand economic downturns. One example I give of that is the state of Texas. Everyone knows Texas doesn't have an income tax, and that's great from an economic development standpoint. But the fact of the matter is their revenue portfolio is not as balanced and diversified as Kansas is. So in 1986 and 1987, there was a very bad sort of regional recession. It wasn't a national recession, but in this part of the country, there was in fact sort of a regional recession because a lot of the key sectors of the economy, agriculture, oil and gas, and aviation manufacturing were all down at the same time. Oil was about $9 a barrel, believe it or not, and gas was about 50 cents per MCF. And we had some tough times in the public sector in Kansas. We had budget cuts and all this kind of thing in 86 and 87, but we didn't have near as tough time as Texas because they get all their money from the sales tax and the severance tax in Texas. Okay, well, once oil hit $9 a barrel and all this, the oil field workers were laid off, and before you know it, office buildings are closing in Houston and Dallas, and no one's getting any sales tax money. So they have some cataclysmically bad problems in the public sector in Texas because they're not as balanced and diversified. So if there's 3 legs to a stool and you've got the stool sitting out on your deck and there's a big windstorm that comes up, that stool is going to be sturdier and is going to be better able to survive the economic windstorm than a 2-legged or a 1-legged stool. That's sort of the belief there. The other point that was made, this was written by the Governor's Tax Equity Task Force in 1995. Bill Graves was governor by 1995. and from Johnson County, former Governor Bennett was one of the chairs of this group, that they studied the heck out of the state and local tax system, and they said, we think this three legs of the stool approach is good for yet another reason. We think if you keep a broad-based, you cast a broad net with a balanced and diversified revenue portfolio, that's a way of avoiding this kind of race to the bottom and interstate tax competition for any particular tax, okay? It's a way of avoiding it. Keep the basis broad and the rate low on all the taxes, and don't get into this game of battling with the other states. They thought that was the best sort of tax policy. Okay, well, let's look at where we are now. This is what was on the table heading into the 2012 session. Okay, before we began making a lot of these changes, it actually had begun to go back a little bit because of the Great Recession and because income and sales, especially income taxes, were more volatile than is the property tax, which is sort of the steady, stable workhorse of state and local finance. The property tax burden had gotten a little bit higher. It had gotten back up to about 34%, sales and use 28%, and income and privilege had fallen back to 24, 25%. So here it is on the graph. The top is FY92, the green is the income and privilege taxes, the red is sales tax, and the blue is property tax. Policymakers, okay, in the 1990s said, look, everyone's upset about property taxes. We want to saw this off here and make them more equal. And here by 1998, that had happened, okay? Now, here's what's on the table in 2012. But what had happened is we have a whole new set of policymakers who've shown up, and in 2010 and 2012, and they said, no, we think this three legs of the stool approach is not the way to go anymore. We're now concerned more about this interstate idea. We think capital is more mobile than it used to be and all these other kinds of things. So we don't care about this three legs of the approach anymore. We demand to come running in and do major amputation surgery on the shortest leg of the stool. We want to cut income taxes. We want to go toe-to-toe with the big boys from an economic development standpoint like Texas and some of these other states. That's what they set out to do. Okay, now before we abandon the three-leg stool altogether, I want to say that, in fact, abandoning it has led to some other equity issues, and I think Andy's going to talk a little bit more about this. Certainly, if you have a three-legged stool, you've got one relatively progressive leg of the stool. You've got income tax, which is considered the more progressive of the three major tax sources. In other words, as incomes go up, people tend to pay a higher percent of their income in taxation. Property tax is somewhere in the middle between progressive and regressive. I happen to think it's modestly progressive. There's other people that think maybe modestly regressive, depending on your perspective. But property tax is somewhere in the middle. And then, of course, sales, use, and excise taxes are regressive. They're harder on the poor than the other kinds of major taxes. So at least if you've got this broad net that's been cast, you had one of every kind. The other thing that sometimes people forget about the broad-based tax system is that if you cast a broad net, it seems to me that every entity has some kind of skin in the game for the state and local finance system. Okay, those doggone college students, right? They're not paying as little, if any, income taxes, but at least we're getting them with the sales tax and maybe the property tax on their 15-year-old car, right? Or if you're a manufacturing business, we're going to give you every sales tax exemption and property tax exemption known to man, but doggone it, if you're profitable, we're going to get you with the income tax on your business, right? So no matter what kind of entity you were probably paying us at least some one of the major tax sources. So that's another thing about the broad-based revenue portfolio. Now let's talk though about the new Kansas income tax law that of course was enacted last year. For a number of years we had three individual income tax brackets. 3.5% was the bottom bracket, 6.25 middle, 6.45 top. Along comes the new law. The upper bracket, the 6.45% bracket, is now totally repealed. It is totally repealed, 6.45%. We now have a two-bracket system of 3, and then everything above, after you get to the 3 bracket, 4.9, and everything that used to be where the 6.25 bracket kicked in is 4.9. So the upper bracket is totally repealed, and we've significantly reduced the bottom two. The other thing about the new law that you hear a lot about is non-wage business income of these so-called pass-through entities is totally exempt. This is the non-wage business income of these LLCs, subchapter S's, and sole proprietorships, okay? Lines 12, 17, and 18 of Federal IRS Form 1040. Of course, last year, most of the revenue offsets proposed by the governor were non-enacted. Okay, let's be fair to the governor for a second. He had a tax plan that was going to cost on the reduction side about $800 million. Okay, but he had about $700 million of offsets that he recommended to be in the bill. The legislature, when they passed it, liked his tax cuts and didn't like very many of the offsets. So that's why we're going to look at some of the fiscal issues that are come up here in addition to the equity issues. One of the things he proposed last year was that the sales tax freeze, the rate under current law, as we know, is supposed to go down from 6.3 to 5.7. That's back on the table this year. That was taken out of the bill last year. He also wanted all Kansas itemized deductions to be repealed in the income taxes. So look, we lowered the rates and we're exempting some income altogether, so let's do away with itemized deductions. And that was brought back about $450 million. Okay, now, here's what they passed. The severance tax piece there in the middle column, one of his pay-fors did get left in the bill. They relaxed the severance tax exemption. There's some new severance tax money on the table. But if you look here, look at the income tax. Now for FY13, it's not even an annualized impact. There's reduced, we're now in the final 5 or 6 months of FY13. There's some reduced money from withholding and estimated payments here during the final 5 or 6 months. But the annualized impact, when people actually go to file and reconcile their tax year 13 taxes, it's almost $850 million. These changes in the income tax law. Really remarkable. Okay, so you can see here, and the net is over $800 million. Over 6 fiscal years, the whole thing can reduce available resources to the general fund by $4.5 billion in a cumulative FY18 ending balance sense. Okay, pretty big numbers, and I think Dwayne is going to be talking about the implications here, certainly of some of this. Okay, so some of these equity issues that have come up. Again, we've eliminated the income taxes for these pass-through entities. We've cut the other individual income tax rates significantly, and we've repealed the top rate altogether. We have repealed the food sales tax rebate credits. One of the things that the governor paid for that did stay in the bill last year was in Kansas, unlike a lot of states, we tax groceries. Some states exempt groceries, and this was an issue that was often debated in Kansas, should we exempt groceries. But since the late 1970s, we don't. We had this separate credit that effectively paid some of the low and modest income folks back for the sales tax they paid throughout the calendar year on food, and it went back to them as a refundable income tax credit. I think there's only 1 or 2 other states that don't allow some kind of credit like this that go ahead and fully tax groceries. Okay, Missouri taxes groceries at a very low rate. I think their state sales tax rate is 5.225 or something along these lines, and they have a tax of like only 1.225 on groceries. So they've got a significantly reduced rate on food, and a lot of states exempt food altogether. But we did repeal our food sales tax rebate credits, and effective tax year 13. I think a lot of people a year from now, when they go to file their tax year 13 income taxes, are going to be a little bit shocked to discover this doesn't exist anymore. They'll notice that for the first time. We also kicked renters out of the homestead property tax refund programs. It's a similar program that helps low and moderate income seniors and some of the working poor and people with dependent children be able to effectively pay their property taxes. And of course, the theory, like a lot of states that have these programs, are that people who rent are paying property taxes because it's passed along to them in their rent by their landlords. But now we've kicked renters out of the homestead program. Okay, so if you're a single mom with 3 kids running a trailer, you can't qualify for homestead property tax rebates anymore to help you continue to pay your rent in the trailer. So now we've got, because of some of these changes, especially on the income tax side, you've got kind of a weird deal where I've had accountants tell me, look, Chris, there isn't going to be a single doctor, lawyer, pharmacist, real estate agent, or accountant left in the state paying the state in the income taxes. All these people are going to set themselves up as one of these new tax-exempt entities. The only people left paying income taxes are going to be sort of the wage earners. So now the concern is, okay, the veterinarian is not going to be paying the state any income taxes. But the poor little gal making $6 an hour answering the phone when the darn barking dogs come into the waiting room, she's going to be paying the state income taxes. Okay, so it's sort of a whole new set of equity issues that I think some people are certainly concerned about. Let's talk about the 2013 dynamics of the debate. As I said, most of the governor's pay-fors, notwithstanding some of the ones we just talked about, were left out of the bill. The big two being the sales tax freeze, which is in the neighborhood of $250 million, and then the itemized deductions repeal, about $450. So the governor had a political problem. Okay, how am I going to get a reasonable-looking fiscal 14, and he went ahead and threw a FY15 budget on the table? How am I going to get a budget out this year? Okay, well, I have to convince the anti-tax crowd, some of whom were just elected here this most recent year, to look anew at some of my pay-fors that got left out of the bill last year. Well, how can I convince them to vote yes? I need the sales tax rate freeze and some of these other things. Well, can I have a big tax increase for a couple of years if I can sell them on this? We're going to continue on the glide path to zero. I'm going to kick in a new round of income tax cuts if you guys help me out here and get my sales tax rate freeze and some of my other ideas back on the table. And as I mentioned, of course, there's a new political dynamic after the 2012 elections. Okay, so the governor's a smart man and a pragmatic politician, this kind of thing. So I think he had no choice but to structure his 2013 income tax proposal a lot like this. He said, look, we've got to put the sales tax rate freeze back on the table. I'm going to go after a couple of the big ticket items from the itemized deduction repeal proposal from last year that got left on the table. We're going to repeal the mortgage interest and the property tax itemized deductions. And then I'm going to kick in a new round of income tax rate cuts that are especially going to accelerate here in 3 or 4 years. And then also, if we get taxes growing, I'm going to trigger in additional cuts. So here's what his tax plan looks like as it was proposed. You can see here, sales tax rate freeze was about $260 million, and you repeal these itemized deductions, that's positive money, and then you've got some modest income tax rate changes that kick in here. The bottom line is, FY14 and 15, it's a tax increase of over $800 million. And if you go out through FY16, it's over $1.1 billion, okay? You frankly have to have this money over the next couple of years in order to be able to afford the amount of spending he's proposed in his budget, because last year's tax bill, nobody thought it was ultimately going to pass in the version that it did, where it was so costly. Now, the other problem, though, in order to get this money in his budget, of course, it's politically hard to convince policymakers to vote for tax increases. He's had to promise them these big income tax rate cuts. Get out here a few years. Look at the income tax changes out here in fiscal 17 and 18 when these big rate cuts kick in, okay? As bad as the out-year budget problems were from last year's bill, they're ultimately going to get worse here if something like the governor's bill is enacted. Now, it'll glide down to zero in income taxes at some point, okay? But what are the implications for the overall state budget by fiscal 16, 17, and 18? Certainly, that's another component of the concerns. Paul mentioned we're getting ready to head into the veto session here. Here's what the shape of the debate so far. The Senate has passed a bill not totally out of the conceptual universe of where the governor is. The Senate said okay to the rate freeze. It's doing something different on the itemized deduction than the governor is. It's got his income tax rate cuts in it. It's got some other things, but you can see it's less than the governor. Remember, the governor had a 455 here and a 355 here. So even under the Senate plan, it's either going to have to come out of ending balances, or you're not going to be able to spend as much as the governor thought by the end of FY15. It's not as much. Now, the House keeps saying no to the sales tax rate. We don't want to, we made this promise in 2010, the rate was going to come down. That has not passed the House yet. They're doing something totally different on itemized deductions, a complicated formula. They're kicking in additional rate cuts when you got a few years. To be fair to the House, not nearly as much as the governor and the Senate, but there's just no money here. There's less than $200 million by the end of FY14. So you can't pass the governor's budget without totally cannibalizing whatever ending balances I think you had. Really, at FY14 into FY15, you're going to have a heck of a problem if you can. So in a lot of ways, the whole debate has gotten around to this being the biggest number still on the table, sort of the sales tax piece. Okay. So let me just wrap up here, and then I'll hand it off. What are the policy implications of more of the tax cuts? Obviously, the future of the state budget was already, some people thought, imperiled as a result of last year's tax cuts. We're going to kick in new ones like the Senate and the governor want to do. What are the long-run implications there? The other thing is the governor put his tax plan together after his budget was already in bed. What was in his written budget proposed in January did not contemplate, it did contemplate a sales tax rate freeze, but it did not show the impact of those huge $1 billion income tax cuts by FY17 and 18. So his budget isn't even internally consistent with his own tax plan. So that's added a layer of confusion to everything we've been talking about this session. Then, of course, what are the implications, and the governor and people certainly much smarter than me are talking about this as we speak, what are the implications for higher ed, if there's going to be more budget cuts, there's the ongoing school finance litigation, and your other speakers are going to talk more about social services and other things. Of course, the hope is we're going to get some economic development stimulus from tax cuts at some point that could offset some of this money, and that's still something as revenue estimators we're continuing to talk about. And then if there is offsetting revenue, is it ever going to come close to providing enough relative to the size of the tax cuts that were enacted last year and are proposed a new round this year? And so these are the questions that are facing policymakers before they come back on May 8th. And I guess I will wrap up and get ready to hand the microphone off to the next speaker, and we'll be around later for more questions.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here tonight and appreciate the opportunity to have a chance to visit with you. And we'll look forward to your questions after we've all had a chance to do our presentations. I'd like to pick up where Chris has left off and visit with you about the budget implications of the tax plan that has been enacted last year. The legislature currently faces a very tough budget. They're trying to set a budget for fiscal year 2014, which is the budget year which begins this coming summer on July 1. And the problem that they face is that spending, our current level of spending, far outpaces the expected revenue for next year. The official forecast for revenue after the tax cuts have kicked in, that Chris described, after the income tax cuts kick in, and after the sales tax drops back from 6.3% to 5.7%. The official estimate for revenue for the Kansas State General Fund is right at $5.4 billion. That's for next year. But right now this year, Kansas is currently spending $6.2 billion. So that's a difference of almost, it's between $700 and $800 million. So it's not possible to keep the current level of spending unless there is some new revenue put into the picture. And I'd like to try to describe that and give you a little bit more background about the budget. And let's start by taking a quick look at the whole budget. Imagine that this box is the whole state budget. In total, Kansas is about a $14 billion a year operation if you count everything. If you count all the federal dollars that come in, the tuition that gets paid at state universities, the fees that we pay for things like driver's licenses or other kinds of things, if you count lottery tickets, if you count everything, it's a $14 billion deal. But usually when we're talking about the state budget, we're referring to this part right here, which is the state general fund, because that's where almost all of our taxes that we pay go, and that's the fund that the legislature and governor have the most discretion over. And that's where the problem is. That's where the issues are. The state general fund is about a $6.2 billion fund right now. And I'm going to talk just a little more about that. We can come back to some of these other things if you wish, but I'm going to concentrate just on this state general fund portion. Here's a pie chart which shows you where the money comes from right now to fund the state general fund. And observe here that almost half right now comes from individual income taxes. And another, well over a third, comes from sales and use taxes. And then there's a smattering of smaller things. There's a corporate income tax, there's a severance tax, which is a tax on oil and gas, tobacco, cigarette taxes, and liquor taxes, and a series of smaller things. But the thing to observe here is that the individual income tax and the sales tax are the big ones. And the individual income tax is on its way down. Now, let's keep that in mind, and let's jump on to where the money goes. And I think this is particularly important because by looking at this, I think we can all understand how hard it is to actually cut the budget. If legislators only have $5.4 billion of income to work with next year, and the current level of spending is $6.2 billion, one option that they have is to cut spending. They could cut spending from $6.2 billion down to $5.4, and they balance the budget. But let's think about that a little bit. Here's a chart which shows how Kansas is currently spending its state general fund dollars. Half, 50 cents of every tax dollar that we all pay goes straight into the school finance formula to support the roughly 300 school districts that Kansas has, and goes straight out of the state general fund to education, kindergarten through 12th grade education. Another 12.3% goes to higher education, KU, K-State, Wichita State, community colleges, to support higher ed. If you put those two together, the higher ed and K-12, you've got 62.3% of the budget, almost 2/3, going straight to education of some kind or another. Another almost 20%, almost 20 cents of every tax dollar we pay, goes to pay for the Kansas share of Medicaid. Medicaid, as many of you know, is a health program for low-income Kansans. The federal government pays for the majority of it, but Kansas has to pay for about 40%. And the Kansas share takes up a large slice of the pie. About 350,000 Kansans get their health care through Medicaid. Most of those are children, over half are children, and that costs us about 20% of the state general fund. If you add that on to what we're already paying for education, you're at 82%. And then add in another slice of the pie here, which is human services that are not Medicaid. That's things like state hospitals, other kinds of social service programs, health programs of different kinds. If you add that slice in right there, then you're at almost 90% going for either human services or education. These other slices are smaller. You've got a public safety slice, which funds our prison system and the Highway Patrol and the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and a slice in here for general government, which is the legislature and the court system and some of the state agencies, and a little tiny slice for agriculture and natural resources. Well, now, why can't the legislature just cut that down from $6.2 billion to $5.4 and match the revenue? Well, right now, whoops, got a little ahead there. Right now, there's a lawsuit pending, heading or already to the state Supreme Court, essentially alleging that Kansas is not spending enough on school finance. with that kind of a lawsuit, which Kansas very well might lose, we've already had a lawsuit, or a similar lawsuit in the last decade, which did end up causing a lot of new money to go into school finance. Kansas could very well lose that, so it's very difficult now for legislators to cut the budget for education back with that kind of a lawsuit pending. If education gets cut back, the chances that Kansas loses that lawsuit go up. Similarly, on Medicaid, Kansas has embarked on a new system called CanCare, which essentially contracts the Medicaid program out through 3 private companies. So we're right now, we've pretty much sealed in this set of costs through those contracts. So it's going to be very difficult to cut the Medicaid program back. So that leaves you, these 2 areas are pretty much set. And that leaves higher education, a few other social services, and public safety. And what has happened so far is that the legislature has tried or been working to make some cuts into higher education, and they've been making some pretty deep cuts in general government, especially at in the court system, but have left Medicaid and public education alone. As a result, the budget that is moving through the legislature right now it'll probably wind up, looks like someplace around $6 billion or a little over $6 billion maybe, but still very far above the revenue estimate for next year. So somehow, in order to make the budget balance out, the legislature is going to have to find some revenue in order to match the spending that they are getting ready to authorize. One final slide that I'll show you, which is a history. It puts the spending and the revenue together and shows a history of spending and revenue in the state general fund. The red line is spending and the green line is the revenue. And back here, you can see it in the back, it starts in 1992 and comes up to the present. And you can see the steady progression of things. If you get here at about 2002, you notice that the revenue line drops down. That's a recession. The recession before the big recession. After that recession, the economy was good for a time, and revenue went up quite substantially. And through this period, spending went up right with it, because more money was put into school finance and more money was put into Medicaid. But then we got to a point here where the big recession started. And you notice that there's a period of years here where revenue exceeds expenditures. There's a whole series of years. And then you get to 2 years here as the recession is starting, where spending is above revenue. It's possible for the state to spend more than it takes in a given fiscal year if the state has some savings, if the state has money in the bank. And that happened here at the beginning of the recession. The state entered that period with a lot of money in the bank. And for 2 years, it was possible to spend more than the state took in. But then the recession went for a third year, revenue fell for a third year in a row, the savings were gone, and Kansas had no option but to cut spending in order to make revenue and expenditures balance. That's the fundamental rule that Kansas has to follow, that the legislature and governor have to follow. Kansas cannot spend more than it has in the bank. It's possible to spend more than it takes in a given fiscal year if there's a savings, if there's a bank balance. But once the bank balance is gone, revenues and expenditures have to line up. It's completely different than how the federal government operates. Kansas cannot operate like that. The federal government just simply borrows money if it doesn't have enough revenue. Kansas cannot do that. But because Kansas cannot do that, that presents the legislature with its special problem for this next year, because revenue, because of the tax cut, is now falling off, and there's the forecast for next budget year. You've got a revenue forecast here, you've got spending up here. The legislature is probably going to pass a budget that's someplace about there, and that's not a very lavish budget. That's really a pretty, it's quite a bare bones budget in a lot of ways, but it is still hundreds of millions of dollars more than the revenue estimate. So somehow, those two things have to be trued up. Somehow, revenue and expenditures have to be made to match. Luckily, for Kansas, there is a bank balance now, so one option for the legislature is to use up the bank balance. That would close to cover things for about 1 year. But once the bank balance is gone, this same difference between revenue and spending still has to be brought back together. I'm going to stop there and hand the problem off, or hand the challenge off to Annie, and I'll be happy to answer questions later.
I've used pretty colors in my illustrations to try to liven things up a little bit. I'm pleased that we're having this conversation. I think given the healthy list of topics that we are approached with, Dwayne and Chris did a great job in sort of covering a breadth of our tax structure and then also what some of the budget implications are. And I think also, you know, when we move from this to this sort of the next analysis, it's important to sort of wrap our heads around what are the implications for some of the real tangible things we can look at and touch and feel, like schools and transportation and healthcare, and how do we continue funding those, and how do we maintain quality of life that we as Kansans really have come to appreciate and celebrate too in our state. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how Kansas stacks up to some of the other no income tax states. I think earlier on in the session there was a lot of conversation about how as Kansas we should aspire to be like Texas. And then at some point South Dakota became the new Texas, and we started chasing after South Dakota. And so in fairness, I decided let's look at all the other 9 no income tax states, and let's see how we stack up against those states and some of the quality of life indicators. And let's also talk about the other taxes that have not been mentioned when we're looking at Texas and South Dakota and the other great havens that we should be like, and that is property and sales tax. And where do we rank with those? And in fairness, I should also say that to be upfront about my data sources, because sometimes in these presentations people don't like to cite their data. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, and the National Center for Education Statistics. If you want those citations after, you can always email me or be happy to you. So I'm looking at this. You can see that my box is bigger than my slide. But so I thought it was important to look at educational outcomes because certainly a lot is made about education, and when we're talking about economic development, a well-trained workforce is what's important to attract business to a state. And to that end, we need high school graduation rates. We need students entering the workforce ready and prepared. And when we look at this, and I'll sort of just do a quick summary of this, Kansas outperformed 6 other no-income tax states, and Kansas is in the first column, and all the other no-income tax states follow. Kansas outperforms 6 no-income tax states in student-teacher ratios. And we know that small class size is important to promote student achievement, particularly in the earlier stages, and then also for low-income students. It also increases the likelihood that students are going to attend college. Certainly we have room to improve, but we outperform 6 of the other 9 no-income tax states. When it comes to high school graduation rates, we outperform 7 of the 9 no-income tax states when it comes to graduating students from our high schools. And again, at 19th, there is room for Kansas to improve, but we certainly are doing better than a bulk of these other states that we've been asked to compare ourselves to. And when it comes to per pupil spending, which a lot of times there's money that's been made of this session about how much money Kansas spends per pupil, we actually spend less per pupil than 5 of the other no-income tax states. And we're sitting at 24th out of the country. And so I say this because when it comes to talking about our economic future, we absolutely must maintain that educational investment. And as you saw Dwayne point out earlier, in terms of SGF or state general fund spending, 50% of that goes to our K-12 education. And so I think this is by way of saying, really we're outperforming a bulk of the no-income tax states, and if we want to continue that investment, we want to continue to see those outcomes, we need to continue to maintain or improve that level of investment. In terms of people living in poverty and uninsured, reducing the number of children living in poverty is one of the governor's roadmap goals, as some of you may know. And when it comes to how we sort of stack up in terms of people living in poverty and insurance rates, we do better than 6 other states in overall poverty. And these, the first bar is percentage of living in overall poverty, which is orange. The second bar is percentage of children living in poverty, which is red. And then the third bar, which is blue, is the percentage of uninsured in each state. We do well or better than 6 states in childhood poverty. Early on, what was astonishing to me when the governor said, look, Texas, here comes Kansas, I knew what a lot of these quality of life indicators were for Texas. And Texas has the highest poverty rate in the country. They also have the greatest share of low-income jobs. There certainly has been a job boom in Texas, and it's been low-income jobs, which has contributed considerably to their poverty rates. And when it comes to percentage of uninsured Kansans, or percentage of uninsured in our state rather, we do well or better than 8 other states. So in terms of continuing these investments, losing that income tax revenue is going to have a significant impact in how well we perform compared to these other no-income tax states. It's important to remember that a lot of these states have other sources of revenue. Certainly Texas, there's been a lot made about the oil revenue that Texas has, in Florida with tourism, similarly New Hampshire. It's also important to remember population size when we're talking about some of these things. Another piece is that Kansas has lower unemployment rates than 7 of the 9 no-income tax states. These are all things that are important to illustrate, because a lot of times these details are not brought up when we're talking about comparing ourselves to where we want to go, to the glide path to 0. So we're currently outperforming them. What's going to happen when we lose that revenue? This may be the doom and gloom part of my presentation. Another thing, Chris was mentioning the regressive part of taxes and sort of the disparity in terms of impacts of the tax policy that's been proposed. And the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP, produced some analysis of the governor's tax plan, which is also available on their website. And I didn't create a slide for this because I quickly looked it up as Chris was talking. But what's interesting is that the governor's proposal, which Chris outlined earlier, which looks somewhat similar to the Senate's proposal, maintains the sales tax rate, gets rid of the mortgage interest, property tax deduction, what's the other big piece? And then
income tax cut.
Right, and then income tax cuts, the big piece. For the sort of 60% and below of Kansas, so the lowest 20% to the middle 60%, at most, they see an income tax break of $334. That's the max that 60% of Kansans would see. Actually, the lowest 20% of Kansans would see an increase of $95. But if we take that to the top 5%, the top 4% is going to see a tax break of $5,000, and the top 1% of Kansans would see a tax break of $28,000. That tax burden has been shifted, and the break that we talk about giving is disproportionate. And we have lost that revenue then to fund these very critical services that we talk about, which actually do attract businesses to our state. Chris also mentioned last year the repeal of the food sales tax rebate. We are now in the illustrious company of Mississippi and Alabama as one of now 3 states that taxes food and offers no tax break then to low income or elderly or disabled. He didn't mention, but also repealed last year, was a child and dependent care credit, another broad-reaching credit that is relied upon by low and moderate income Kansans. The homestead credit was mentioned, and it should also be mentioned that up for discussion this year is the earned income tax credit. What's interesting about that is the earned income tax credit can only benefit working Kansans, and it helps around 220,000 Kansans annually. And there was a proposal to swap about half of what goes towards the earned income tax credit over to another program that helps with property tax relief. Why are our property taxes high? I'll just let you sit with that for a minute. So, we'll get back to that later. In addition, ratio of household income of the top 20% to the bottom 20%, you can see Kansas hovers around the middle of the pack. This disparity is going to grow, most certainly, if we look to eliminate the income tax in Kansas. And what that means then is a greater number of people living in poverty, a greater number of people needing to access the social safety net, which, oh, by the way, we're cutting significant funding for because we no longer have the resources in the budget to support those programs. So it's real circular in nature when we're talking about this, right? And it's also one of the reasons why I think when I'm often talking about this to broader audiences, is explaining that, you know, I, as a homeowner in Lawrence, Kansas, with no children in the school system, why should I care about how schools are funded? Because if it goes down at the state level, it's going to impact, it's going to be passed on to the locals, and my property taxes are going to go up. So I should care, right? So this is something universally as a community that we all should care about. So I mentioned, I sort of talked about some of the quality of life indicators. So let's cut to the chase and talk about per capita property and sales tax comparisons. When it comes to, well, where are these other states getting their revenue? It's not just from oil and it's not just from tourism, because I don't think a lot of people are vacationing in South Dakota. I could be wrong. But where is it coming from? It's coming from higher property and sales taxes. That's, you know, pull the curtain back, and that's what's not being discussed. New Hampshire, New Hampshire has no state sales tax. They have an overwhelmingly, they're at the highest peak there for property tax. Their per capita property tax is roughly $1,200 higher than Kansas. And I think as Kansans, we largely feel that our property tax is already high. So this, when I look at this, this is the writing on the wall. This is where we're headed. To generate the revenue that we need to continue funding state services, it's going to require taxes going up. And whether that be through sales tax or use tax or property taxes, whether it comes down from the state or the buck is passed on to local municipalities to then make those decisions and passed on to all of us, it's going to happen. Undoubtedly, we see that the sales tax proposal is in place. Why is that? Because we need the revenue. So it's already started. This is not 5 years down the road. This is beginning now. We rank 19th in per capita comparison on property tax. We are ahead of 5 of the 9 no income tax states. And we rank 15th in per capita comparison on sales tax, and in that category we're ahead of 7 of the 9 no income tax states. And it should be said that the 2 that we're not ahead of don't levy a state sales tax. New Hampshire and Alaska is represented there, but it's actually not a state sales tax. And so this is really important as we're looking at where we're headed. Without the revenue, we can't make the key investments that we've talked about in education and transportation and public safety and health. And those, in truth, are what are going to drive entrepreneurs and businesses to come to Kansas, not the no income tax. It was interestingly, I was reading how, I think it was a week ago, Alco relocated from their headquarters from Abilene, Kansas, which you know is right along I-70, and smaller community, certainly to Dallas. Now in terms of community size, there's no real comparison between Abilene and Dallas, just in case you didn't know. But what was interesting was that Alco said that they wanted to go to a larger area where they could attract business executives. Now, there are no mountains in Dallas that I'm aware of, and it's certainly not next to the ocean. And Kansas does have larger areas that can compete with Dallas, Wichita and Kansas City being 2 notable ones. But they chose to move to Dallas. And it should be said that if we want to attract businesses, we need to make those key investments. We need to properly fund our school system and certainly our transportation. So some of the future implications, I think we've talked about these to some extent. I have 2 bonus ones that I scribbled down when Chris was talking that are not up here. And I think one of the future implications that we're seeing, again, right now, is I mentioned the EITC swap for the property tax relief. We shouldn't pit low-income groups against one another, but that's the practice that we find ourselves in because we don't have room in the budget to properly support property tax relief for seniors and disabled and low-income families. Instead, we take from another program designed to help low-income working Kansans. Additionally, we're going to be going after budgets and limiting services. When Dwayne showed the graph that where we saw revenue dip and spending dip in 2010, Kansas didn't rely on raising revenue to shore up the budget. They cut the budget. They relied on about 50% on budget cuts. And it's important that we remember that moving forward because there becomes increasingly limited room to cut any more budgets. It's not as though we're operating with a ton of fat in the state, despite what people might like to tell you. We're also going to be limited in terms of opportunities that we can take advantage of, say perhaps Medicaid expansion, because we don't have the resources or the revenue to be able to sustain that. So besides standing around and giving a group hug and telling everyone it's going to be okay, there are some things that you can do. Certainly reach out to your legislators. The Kansas Center for Economic Growth is a new organization that launched in January, and we have a lot of fact-based short briefs available on our website, 1 to 3 pages, easy to read, fun little graphs and charts. But they're really, they're aimed at creating a broad understanding of these issues that we're talking about. We're also available on Twitter and Facebook, and I try to be not as sarcastic on Twitter because it doesn't come across very well on Twitter in 140 characters. We also encourage you to construct letters to the editors or other opinion pieces to share with newspapers. And I think it's worth, if you haven't seen Dwayne's budget blog, it is absolutely worth checking out. Dwayne takes some of the most complicated budget stuff and puts it into about what fits on one screen, one computer screen. And you can certainly get in touch with him. He's not paying me for this endorsement. But his budget blog has been, I think, one of the key pieces for really understanding some of the hard stuff we're facing. And he does it in a very nonpartisan way, which I think we can all appreciate. So that's mine. I'm going to pass it off to Ed, who's going to talk about some of the implications then for Johnson County.
This is a very, very quick budget overview for the 2013 budget. And just in case you've forgotten, we are beginning work on the 2014 budget. We have to submit our budgets by August. The 14 budget has to be submitted by August of this year. So we are estimating revenues and we are estimating expenditures about 12 to 18 months ahead of time. We've tried to get that changed, but so far, no luck. We'd like to be a little more current, but that's the way it is. The county's budget, including reserves for 2013, is about $815 million. We have 3,900 full-time employees, and we budgeted capital expenditures of $97 million. The assessed valuation in the county, $7.5 billion. That was about a 0.3% decline in assessed valuation from the year earlier. To give you an idea, almost 26% of our revenues come from property taxes, 166 million. Our estimated rate, or our rate for 2013 is the same as 2012, no change. The average residential property owner pays $635 in county property taxes. Now, that's not all your property taxes. You've got cities, you've got school districts. Historically, school districts account for about 60 to 62% of the property taxes that you pay. This is a pie chart of showing where our revenues come from. Ad valorem, that's real estate property tax. 26% of our revenues come from there. Sales and use taxes, about 15%. Whoops, I've done something wrong. Down at the bottom, WW, that's Johnson County Wastewater, and they are probably one of the biggest portions of our consolidated budget. Even though they do not receive any tax support or any general fund support, wastewater is a utility, operates much like Water One. The users of the system pay the charges. There are no property taxes that support wastewater. The sales tax in Johnson County The total sales tax when you throw in cities is somewhere around 10%. 9.5%, it might be 10.5% in some places where the cities have transportation districts or some kind of community improvement districts. But most of the taxes collected in Johnson County go to the state, 72%. The county receives 6% of the total sales tax, the city's 21%, and then in 2008, the taxpayers approved the Johnson County Research Triangle tax to support K-State, KU Edwards, and KU Clinical Trial Center. That's about 1%. To give you an idea of property tax rates in Johnson County over the last 4 or 5 years, and you'll notice we have a general fund property tax, and then we have a designated tax for the library, and then we have a designated property tax for park and recreation. So the total mill levy in 2013 is 23.188. To put our mill levy in perspective, you can look at some of the other urban counties in Kansas, and you'll notice Sedgwick County is at 29, Douglas County is 12.5 mills above where ours is. Shawnee County is almost 20 mills higher than is Johnson County's property tax rate. Here's what happened. You saw some of the budget numbers. Here's what happened in Johnson County as a result of the near depression of 2008, 9, and 10. Our property taxes went down from a high of $182 million, and then 3 years later we were at $167 million. 15 million a year less. That's a big, big hit. In 2013, we'll reach the low point, and then in 2014, we estimate that values will start going back up. There will be additional new homes built in the county, new businesses come to the county, and so those property taxes will go back up. But even at 2017, we haven't reached the levels of 2006, 2007. So that's one of our challenges. This is an interesting chart. Most people don't even give it thought. We collect the mortgage registration fee, which goes to the county's general fund. And you can see what happened in it in 2006, 2005, 2006, we were running around $18 to $20 million a year. Every time you file a mortgage, you pay a fee. And we hit a low point in 2010 of about 11 million. So if we were still at that 2003, 2004 level, your property taxes could be lowered, but we're not. We're probably going to generate revenue of about 113 million the current year on mortgage registration. That's just another chart showing what's happened to property tax rates in the county. And again, I'm not including the cities in here or the school districts. Those are in addition. And some of those tax rates have gone up in the last 3 or 4 years. Operating expenditures, where is most of our money spent? Well, public safety, 25% of our budget goes to the sheriff, the jails, community correction, courts, district attorney's office, all of those public safety associated services. Infrastructure, 23%. That would include wastewater and streets, roads, what have you. Now, most people aren't aware that many of the services the county provided, we have to provide them because of state requirements. State statute requires the county to provide these kind of services. And this was last year, 2012, the bill for providing these services on local taxpayers was $125 million. So it does make a difference what happens in Topeka as to what the local effort in these service areas require. One of them is the Department of Motor Vehicle on there. Yeah. We had, because of the new computer system that was put in place in May of this past year, We had to increase our, by about $600,000, we had to hire new employees to implement that new computer system. Computers are supposed to make it more efficient and lower costs. The state's new computer did absolutely the opposite. But, you know, mental health, I'll mention that. There's a local effort of $9.5 million to promote or to support mental health services. Now, state issues and our impact to Johnson County, I mentioned DMV. That's 600,000 new expenditures that are going to be there year after year after year. CanCare is one that we're watching closely. This is the one where they're placing Medicaid operation within the hands of 3 private insurance companies. And why should the county be concerned about that? Well, we see 10,000 people a year, clients a year, at the Johnson County Mental Health Office. Some of them are private pay, some of them insurance pay, most of them receive Medicaid payments. We see 2,000 people a year who are what's diagnosed as with severe mental illness. These are folks who may not get out of bed in the morning, who probably don't have a job, want to have a job, need to be reminded to take their medication, need to be assisted in finding a place to live. That's about a $2 million number annually to cover those costs. We're not sure that we don't know whether those costs are going to be reimbursed or not. If they're not, then the county has to step in and pick up that cost, or we do not pick up the cost, and these folks go out on the street, or they end up in jail at a cost of $125 a day to the taxpayers. So the similar situation with some of the developmentally delayed population. The long-term care services for the DD population consists of residential services, consists of sheltered workshop, which the county pays about $5 million a year to support those workshop activities. We just completed an $8 million expansion of the workshop to support those activities. Then the job coaches out in the community, placing these folks in jobs. The MCOs have absolutely no experience in costing those kind of services. They're great at health services. You know, their business model is to deny, delay, deny, delay, deny, delay. Well, with this population, you can't delay a place to live. You can't delay a sheltered workshop opportunity. But those numbers are pretty big. Human services, public health, also were impacted by the decisions that will be made in Medicaid. So in that area, our biggest issue is, and we continue to try to find out from the insurance companies, in these spatial areas, what's going to be reimbursed, what's not going to be reimbursed. We can't find out to this day. Let me touch on job creation. I just got a couple of left. I thought it was interesting when I did the State of the County address. I went back and looked at some of the employment numbers for the state of Kansas, and then looked at Johnson County. You know, there's been a lot of conversation about the decade of lost jobs in Kansas. Well, if you go back and look at what happened during 2002, 2003, that was a recession. We had the tech bubble that burst in 2000, and we had 2 years of the recession. Then in 2009, 2010 was the near depression. Kansas lost almost 50,000 jobs in 2009 and almost 20,000 jobs in 2010. If you subtract out those recession years, we didn't have a job loss. So when I look at these numbers, I wonder Was it the recession and the near depression that cost Kansas those jobs? Or was it tax policy? I'll leave that up to your judgment. I think it's obvious. In Johnson County, in 2011, Johnson County created or 99% of the new jobs in the state of Kansas. In 2012, the latest data we have is the first 9 months of 2012, 52% of the new jobs in Kansas were created in Johnson County. And I guess this tells me something else. I wish somebody would look at the jobs and economic growth model that's been used in Johnson County for decades and decades. And that is strategic investments in education, secondary and higher ed, strategic investments in public safety, strategic investments in infrastructure, and strategic investments in recreational parks, those kind of amenities. I believe it works, and it will work for the state of Kansas probably better than the current program that's being proposed. That's all I've got.
I'm going to start with Chris. Has the governor provided any projections to prove how the tax cuts will attract business to Kansas? How many businesses will come, and how will these businesses benefit the state, particularly revenue-wise?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. At the end of last session, they ran some kind of model over the Department of Revenue, and they said between the years 2012 and 2020, they anticipated there would be 22,900 new jobs created solely as a result of the new tax law. Or over that 8-year period, slightly less than 3,000 jobs a year. Now, you know, there's a multiplier effect and other kinds of things, but that number of jobs, of course, is not going to be ultimately producing anywhere near the amount of money to offset income tax cuts of $800 million a year. So that's sort of one of the ongoing kinds of issues. And then, of course, the hope was to sort of reverse some of the out-migration data, get businesses moving into Kansas who wouldn't otherwise move into Kansas, and this kind of thing. Whether that's working or not, you know, we don't know. The hope was all the new tax cut money was going to be plowed back into the Kansas economy and bounce around with the multiplier effect and this kind of thing. So you'd see some growth in some of the sales and consumption taxes as a result of the income tax cut. From an economic standpoint, that's certainly true. Some of that's going to occur. The great question is how much of it. We had a former legislator from Johnson County, former Senator Bob Van Crum, came in at the outset of the 2012 debate, and he said, look, guys, it's great you're talking about tax cuts to stimulate the economy, but he made an interesting point. He said, I don't know that this tax cut is all that well targeted. There's no link into it to make sure people do what you want. He said, he gave an example. He said, I'm a silent partner in an LLC that owns a shopping mall over here in Johnson County. Now, if you guys cut taxes on that particular revenue stream, I'm not going to create any jobs with that. I might put my wife on an airplane and go to Las Vegas, okay? You don't... Okay, he owns a small used car dealership there in Topeka. He said the tax cut was going to be worth somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 to him. Okay, well, he can't create a new job with the $5,000 to $10,000. Now, maybe he buys a new air conditioner. His car dealership money bounces around the economy and this kind of stuff. So jobs, you know, certainly we would hope provide a significant amount of offsetting revenues. I don't know, but I think we're certainly going to find out.
So the next question is for Dwayne. Is the expected fiscal year 2013 ending balance about $450 million? If so, would that money and money from KDOT about balance the fiscal year 14 budget at fiscal 13 level? For 1 year.
Yes. Am I on here? Okay. Yes, you could use up the balances, the bank savings, and you could shift a certain amount of costs over to the highway fund and figure out a way to get out of to make a fiscal year 2014 budget that's about the same as what we have right now in 2013. You can do that once, but you then still have the very same problem as the legislature tries to do a 2015 budget, because revenues and expenditures still won't match up. Using the bank balances or shifting some things over to KDOT or taking a little money from KDOT doesn't solve the fundamental issue that revenue and expenditures somehow have to match. Sooner or later, the legislature has to do that. They can make it through 1 year and figure out a budget, but then the next year they'll have to somehow still either cut spending dramatically or raise revenue to make things work out.
I have a couple questions for Annie here. One is, so if good education is so vital for our workforce, why haven't the good education we have in Kansas brought jobs to Kansas? And secondly, who is forcing our Kansas legislature to lower the income tax?
I think in terms of why haven't the jobs come to Kansas, I think Ed actually had a good slide showing that the jobs have come to Kansas. And I pulled apart some data. You all may have seen the Kansas obituary that Jason Probst wrote with the Hutch News. He had some response from Kansas Policy Institute and the Kansas GOP, and also a writer, a blogger down in Wichita. And so he called me and he said, "Can you help me pull apart this data that they've put forward?" And so I went through Bureau of Labor Statistics and looked at the data, and actually it didn't bear out what Kansas Policy Institute responded to Jason with. In terms, and again, I mean, to echo the slide that Ed showed, we have grown jobs. We have seen private sector growth, and we also have seen the public sector shrink. So in terms of some of those claims that have been levied, job loss has been occurring across the country in accordance with the recession, and then also the near Great Depression. So we actually are hitting right where other states are hitting as well. This is not a problem that's been unique to Kansas. And so in terms of what we want to do to continue to grow our economy, it's maintaining those investments. And so in terms of who's the guiding hand, was that? This is going to show up on YouTube. But I think that there's some key interest groups that are really invested in Kansas being the no income tax state and the state that gets us to zero. I think when you look at the sort of agenda or playbook that's being used, quite literally, rich states, poor states, the ALEC agenda and the ALEC model, I've literally been at the Capitol sitting in committee and seen people pull that out and reference that. And so when we talk about that being the playbook, that's no joke. That's truly what's driving a lot of this. And I think to some extent, I mean, I would argue it's sort of this being very resolute in that we will show that this can work. And unfortunately, I believe, as I think is a similar tone, that this is not playing out the way that we were promised it would play out. The adrenaline shot to the arm of the Kansas, or to the heart rather, of the, thanks, appreciate that, to the heart of the Kansas economy. If this is an adrenaline shot, I mean, my God, I apparently was dead asleep, because this is not happening. And so, and I think if you've seen, the tone has changed. It was no longer the adrenaline shot. It's now, well, let's just give it some time. It'll work, maybe in 3 to 4 to 5 years. What happens to our state in 3 to 4 to 5 years? I think these guys have shown it. It's a $4.5 billion hole. What happens to our education in that span of time? What happens to our roads? They're going to look like Missouri's roads. They're going to look like Oklahoma's roads, which if you've traveled on them lately, is not a good thing. So in any event, I think that sums up my opinion.
So Ed, I have a couple questions for you. One is pretty basic. What is the average homeowner's property tax bill for county uses, and maybe more policy-oriented, what are your thoughts on the legislative policy mandating reporting to citizens about the automatic revenue increases realized with increases in assessed valuation?
As I recall the slide, it was $635 a year county. That's your average county. The legislation, and I'm not sure where it's at, I'm not sure what the detail is, because it changed a lot from initial to ending. But the original thought was that because we bad locals might have to raise property taxes to offset some of the tax reductions, that we could not, if your property went up because of reappraisal, then we had to count that reappraised portion as being a tax increase. So we would have to sign a document that said we increased your taxes if we did not roll back the mill levy an equivalent percentage to what that appraisal would have. I think the last iteration of that was you've got 2% leeway. So if your appraisal goes up 2% or less, you don't have to take that action. I mean, we all know what it is. It's a gotcha. So that if you need to raise taxes for schools or roads or whatever it is, or you need to capture that increase in property appraisals, your opponent in the next election or this interest group, that interest group can come in and say, you know, you guys, you raise taxes. And that's where they want to get. Now, quite frankly, as mayor, I did it that way. In fact, I did it both ways. When reappraisal kicked in the early 90s, and our valuation would go up 5% because of reappraisal, we reduced the mill levy 5%. And we did that in Overland Park for about 5 or 6 years. Then it got to the point where we couldn't do that anymore. So we did reduce it 5%, but then we had to increase for cops or whatever. So we did raise it back up again, so the taxpayers could see clearly what happened. So I don't have any problem with that kind of transparency, not at all. But it's not for the transparency, it's for the gotcha at election time.
Yeah.
So Dwayne, a couple of Medicaid questions here. I know you're on the edge of that debate at the Health Institute, but the questioner says, I assume Kansas decided to privatize Medicaid thinking that it would be a cost savings. The 3 private insurance companies are for-profit. So how can there be any cost savings without drastic reductions in what's covered by the private insurance? And then secondly, kind of related to this is, what are the projections for Medicaid payments for long-term care, considering the aging baby boomer population in Kansas?
Let's take the first question. And first, we have to define cost savings. The idea of shifting from the way Kansas used to do Medicaid to TennCare does not mean that the cost will go down. It means that the hope is that costs will not rise as rapidly. That's the savings. I think everybody involved believes and understands that Medicaid costs, the actual costs, are going to continue to go up in future years. But the hope is that by switching to TennCare and hopefully operating the Medicaid system, if you could say more efficiently, that the level of increase will be lowered. The way that's been calculated is that there was first a calculation of where we are now, where the state would be if there's no change, and then where the state would be, hopefully, with TennCare. And the difference between those two is what's called the savings. But both of them, both the CanCare and where you'd be without CanCare, both are ultimately increases in Medicaid spending.
For the reasons I indicated earlier, we at the county are tracking what happens in that area very closely. And you've got to be careful reading the information that's released about that program. For instance, in the Lawrence World Journal on the 19th, there was a story out of Topeka that they were already going to save $64 million over 3 years because of the MCOs managing CanCare. And I'm thinking, it's only been 3 months. $64 million doesn't make sense to me. But if you read the whole article, down at the bottom of the article, the $64 million savings was estimated by the budget office because of caseload reductions in those 3 years. Now, when the economy's in the tank, like it has been for a couple of years, you've got more people unemployed, your Medicaid costs, I think, are going to go up. If the economy is improving and those people are moving into new jobs, doesn't it make sense that your Medicaid rules might diminish? I think that's what is being captured, quite frankly, not a reduction in, as a result of MCO's intervention. My opinion.
So Chris, this is part tax, part budget question. On the House side, we have a tax bill in conference that's being debated at this point and what will pass in the veto session. On the House side, the way it's set up is that if there's revenue growth over 2%, then that gets locked in to some decreases in income tax, etc. On the Senate side, it's 4% growth, but they've locked in the income tax reductions on the Senate side. So I guess the question is, taking the House side, given 2% growth, will that ever make up for the several years of reductions in the different programs that Kansas has experienced, that Dwayne helped incur in a previous life? So are we looking at status quo of what programs exist now and with little hope of making up some of that lost ground?
Well, the formulas that they have built into the bill, that the Senate and the governor have explicit further reductions in income tax rates, and then, as you indicated, if revenues are growing beyond 4%, there's additional rate cuts beyond those that are visible in the bill. The House doesn't have visible rate cuts. It only has this formula, anything above 2% gets plowed into rates. The House can't afford an initial visible round of rate cuts because, again, it doesn't have the sales tax piece in its bill. That being said, this glide path to zero business, I don't know how many years. It would take decades, many decades, for the Kansas income tax to get to zero. And even, especially under the House version of the plan, remember I told you the current rates are 3 and 4.9. And because of all the tax cuts that are on the deck anyway for FY14, none of that stuff would trigger. You wouldn't get any trigger until FY15. It doesn't kick in until tax year 16. And then I think the first round of rate cuts under the House bill, the 3% was going to fall to 2.98%, and the 4.9 was going to fall to 4.89%. I mean, it might take them 512 years for the income tax to get to zero. Okay, so, and that's just the way they have the formula set up ready to work. They want to enact future rate relief. The policy question is, the stuff about formulaic rate relief is an interesting policy question. Is there something that's not small d democratic about this current group of policymakers self-aggrandizingly thinking they're smarter than people who are going to be here in 5 years. Why do they need to set the tax policy for the 2018 legislature in advance of those people being elected? It's kind of an interesting issue, all these formulas and things that are going to trigger and continue to strangle the revenue stream. The other point I would make about this is if you've got these weird formulas that are going to kick in, and instead of 4.9, the rate's going to be 4.88 or something, it's going to be determined after the fiscal year receipts come in and published in a rule and reg in the middle of September and then sent out there to the tax practitioners. The stated reason for cutting income taxes is to get people to move to your state, economic development, growth. Well, if our tax system is so complicated you can't easily look at a chart and determine what Kansas tax rates are you really getting your bang for your buck in terms of taxes? If it's this amazingly complicated formulaic kind of thing, what are the Kansas tax rates? I don't know. It's kind of an interesting question.
At a Saturday morning legislative breakfast, one of the senior members of the House from Johnson County talked about this race to zero. He said it only happens if we have higher and higher consumption taxes. That means sales tax. How high, he didn't say.
Well, I got 2 more minutes, so I'm going to ask one more follow-up question for Chris here. So I'm going to put him on the spot here. So last year, they talked about 119,000 LLCs, subchapter S's, sole proprietorships is what this was about. When, in your estimation, are we going to have the best number on how much that income tax reduction is really going to cost the state of Kansas?
We're never really going to have an accurate number, I think, is the bottom line. As you indicated, there were 191,000 entities that were going to be exempted under the old law. And the Secretary of State's office has been releasing data on the number of new filings, okay, that have come in. Now, some of those businesses might have come to Kansas anyway. Okay. The thing is, if there's a new business entity that's been and is filed with the Kansas Secretary, let's say you're Bob Jones Dentistry, LLC. All right. From Nebraska, and so you're one of these people that the new law was designed to incent and attract to Kansas because we're not going to tax you. On the other hand, maybe you were Bob Jones dentist in Overland Park, Kansas last year, and you simply sat down with your accountant and went over and changed your business structure to an LLC so as to avail yourself of the new law. We don't know. All we know are the number of new entities that are being created at the Secretary of State. So whether the law is working or not, it's I indicated earlier, really complicated. And then are you spending all that money in the state, and are you using it to create jobs? That's want the money to bounce around the state. And as Ed indicated, through the multiplier effect, it would then bounce around and hopefully stimulate tax receipts over in sort of the sales and excise tax of the universe. Again, whether it's going to provide enough of an offsetting revenue stream to address this $800 million spending revenue deficit Dwayne has mentioned is sort of the multi-million-dollar question. And at some point we're going to find out. The only other thing I wanted to add is Dwayne mentioned back in 2009, 2010, we did have some ending balances we were sort of able to cannibalize there the first 2 years of the budget crisis. The only other thing, though, that kept us afloat that's not available to us this time is there was federal ARRA money in the pipeline that came in and helped keep the state from making bigger budget cuts than we otherwise would have had to. That spigot has been shut off.
So with that cheery note, unfortunately, I think we need to draw this to a conclusion. I think we should give this expert panel Thanks everybody for coming. I hope you found it informational.